welcome. Thank you all for coming, and very glad to have all of you here today with us. My name is Patrick Tucker. I'm technology editor for the news website Defense One out of Washington, D.C. And we're going to have an awesome discussion right now about the future of public-private partnerships in cybersecurity. Very important and interesting topic of extreme relevance to anybody that's looking at the future of legislation, helping to secure massive enterprises, or for that matter, your own emails and personal data from attack. I had a fantastic conversation yesterday with a fellow that's affiliated with tracking money laundering and cybercrime in the UN, and he said one important takeaway for me is that public-private partnerships in cybersecurity are absolutely essential, and he spent the next 20 minutes talking about that. So we're very fortunate to have this incredible panel here today to discuss it. And with that, let me introduce Gregory Jarrett. He is the head of US and international security at BDO to give some opening remarks. Greg. Yes, please, Pat.
Good afternoon. It's both a privilege and a pleasure for me to be here today and have the opportunity to talk with all of you. I'm very passionate about cybersecurity. I've been asked to keep my remarks to 1 hour and 70 minutes. So I'm kidding. So I'll keep these remarks hopefully quite brief. I thought it might be somewhat amusing, at least for me, to ask a few questions and do a little cybersecurity IQ quiz for all of you, because I'm assuming that most of you are not an IT geek as I am and haven't spent the last 30, 35 years doing systems engineering, satellite communications, telecommunications, and running cybersecurity companies, which is great fun, by the way, okay? But let's tee up a few questions and let's make it fairly easy. Let's do it true, false, okay? So first question, is it true or false that the cybersecurity marketplace in the world today, when we look at both hardware, software, and professional services, is expected to grow from a little over $80 billion in value to $110 billion over the next 2 years? What do you think? Is that true or is that false? It's true. It's absolutely true. All right. That was pretty easy. Let's start with the next one. In terms of ransomware attacks, how many of you have ever seen, heard, or know people that have been impacted by ransomware attacks? Okay. All right. Very good. Is it true or false that of all the industries and sectors of business in the world, that the sector that is most under attack by ransomware and the encryption of database associated with ransom is the healthcare industry? Is that true or false?
True?
It's absolutely true. Most people don't realize, they think financial institutions probably the greatest target, but actually the healthcare industry, because it's actually the honeypot of the most valuable information, personal identifiable information, protected health information, as well as payment card information. All right, let's move on. How about spear phishing? Everybody heard of spear phishing? Anybody been victim of spear phishing recently? Okay, all right. All right, so look, so absolutely, many people don't know that they've actually been attacked, right? Or that their systems have been compromised. So is it true or false that globally the number of spear phishing attacks that have been reported has increased by over 70% in the last year? What do you think? Is that true or false? That's true. Okay. So while we're on the topics of email, how many of you have heard of a concept called business email compromises? Okay. It's one of the fastest internet-based and cybersecurity scams that we've seen growing over the last 18 months all over the world, in both the public sector and the private sector. And in case you're wondering, I lead about 2,500 IT and cybersecurity professionals currently located in 31 countries on 6 continents, running 3 global security operations centers. I don't get a lot of sleep, okay? And I get contacted by government agencies as well as commercial companies on what they can do and how they can spend their money more wisely. One of the biggest problems they're facing today is the Internet of Things. Now, the Internet of Things, most people look at and go, wow, this is fantastic. We're connecting all these devices. We're getting greater access to information. It is a phenomenon, right? I look at it and go, oh my gosh, look at all the vulnerabilities that are being put in place, all the endpoints, all the potential areas that could be hacked. So you see, I have a little different perspective. When we looked at, from the Gartner Group, Forrester Research, and other study groups, the number of attacks and how it's increased with the growing number of internet-connected devices, true or false? There was a 600% increase in the number of cyber attacks on internet-connected devices last year. True or false? Absolutely true, okay? So, look, I could go on and on and on, and I tell stories where most people walk away going, God, that guy just scared the shit out of me, you know. So I try not to do that, but we're at war today in the United States and around the world. And there's 3 different groups that are attacking our information. They at the government level, at the local community level, and of course at all the businesses. And they're number 1, the nation states. And make no doubt about it that China leads in cybersecurity attacks, and what they've spent in terms of funding and resources and technology to enable these attacks, to disrupt economies, and to impact societies is indeed significant. Okay. Second is Russia, third is Iran, and fourth is North Korea. Now, there are other nation state sponsored cyber attack groups, but those are the 4 major. And in the United States, we're dealing with those attacks across every major industry on a daily basis. And in the US, the biggest areas of attack are the financial services sector, number 1. Number 2 is the healthcare industry, which is largely privatized in the United States. And third is our retail industry. Now, close behind that is the critical infrastructure industries, oil, power, water, gas. And then next is our manufacturing automotives. But literally every industry is under attack. Just a couple days ago, I was speaking at a cybersecurity event in Washington, D.C., and I literally had a gentleman in the room almost in tears who was the CEO of a very successful not-for-profit organization doing fabulous work in children's aid research. And he was literally in tears because he just could not believe anybody would do a business email compromise attack and scam his organization out of millions of dollars of donor money. He just could not believe somebody would do that. And he said, Greg, you know, how did this happen? I say, well, these are not compassionate people. I said, these are criminals and they're looking for money. You've got money, and they found an easy way because you have minimal security. So it's not just about being the biggest company. In fact, 30%, in fact, in the last year, 37% of all cybersecurity attacks were targeting small to mid-sized companies. Why? Not because they have so much money or so much valuable information, but it's so much easier to penetrate. Are you with me? The attackers are always looking at what's the honeypot, what's the value that we can monetize versus what's the probability of being able to penetrate in an efficient way. Make sense? So let me share some good news with you, right? Just so people don't say, well, you know, all that guy says is negative stuff, right? There are tremendous technologies that are available to us today to help us counter these attacks. These are what the guys like me, the white hats, try to do to stave off the attacks or mitigate the attacks once they occur. We have great technologies in machine learning, both structured and unstructured. We have great technologies in things like voice-activated capabilities, big data analytics, platforms like ArcSight, platforms like Splunk that allow us to gather vast amounts of machine language, interpret, analyze that, put it into digital dashboards, customize it so we can do intelligence and analysis to determine where attacks either came from or where they might come from in the future. We have the ability to do advanced encryption on software, multi-factor authentication. We can do a lot of very cool things. And more organizations are evolving to a blockchain technology that provides a much more inherently more secure platform. But here's the bad news with all those technologies, they all cost money and they all take time to implement. And unfortunately, most government agencies and most commercial companies are slow to make investments, slow to adopt the latest technologies, and often behind the power curve. And if you're a cyber attacker, all you need to do is find one vulnerability in a network, And before I turn it over to this very illustrious panel, let me share with you, and this might sound weird coming from a techie guy like me, but the weakest link is not in the hardware, it's not in the software, it's in the people, all right? And what you really want to invest your money in, if in nothing else, is what I call a human firewall. And that's investing in the education, the awareness, the training of the people so that they're not going to click on that spam, click on that spear phishing, go to that water hole, go to that or open up that Trojan horse software, click on that link that they shouldn't. All of those things introduce malware and introduce potential vulnerabilities to the organization. Whether you're in government or industry, it's important to understand that the weakest link is the human link. Okay, so with that, we're going to have a lively discussion. My colleague's going to facilitate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, excellent. Well, let me welcome up our panel, and thank you guys so much for being a part of this again. Please feel encouraged to send your questions to Slido so that we can ask them. This is the Habsburg Room, and the code for this particular Slido session is GOBSEC 2019. So let me welcome to the stage Maricha Shaka, who is a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Paul Cornish, a visiting professor from LSE and IDES in London. Excuse me, ideas. It was all capitalized in the catalog. It's not my fault. I was like, oh my, okay. And Ayel Balassir, Chief Global Operations at Czech out of Tel Aviv. So welcome our panelists. Let me give them a round of applause first. And again, the conversation that we're talking about today is public-private partnerships. You all interact with private companies all the time, and you give them lots and lots of data, and you also interact with governments, and you hope your government keeps your data safe in some way or another, and there's a lot of discussion and thought about the best way both of those two things can handle that. So let me start with you guys. How do you characterize the current state of public-private partnerships in cybersecurity, and what do you see as the important trend in that in the next 5 years? Start with you, Maricha.
Good afternoon, everybody. I actually think one of the often overlooked areas when it comes to public-private partnerships is the dependence. The question of how to safeguard the public interest, how to ensure that government plays the role it has to. Like, you know, when I hear statements like "we are at war," we should ask ourselves, who is defending us? And where's the oversight and the control and the accountability of that defense? And so areas like proliferation of government procured technologies, so where the government says we need these kinds of critical infrastructures or cybersecurity measures, put those products or demands in the market, help foster those innovations that you spoke about. But then where does this knowledge go? And how do you make sure that you're not, knowingly or unknowingly, essentially assisting your opponents, whether they be states or the private sector, in waging that quote-unquote war, which I think is a strong term, but you know, those attacks against your very own interests. So while I believe public-private partnerships are vital and they're, you know, part of everything digital and everything cyber related, I'm very interested in the rule of law online, on accountability, on non-proliferation, and making sure that there is a protection also of the public interest, even as private sector companies are engaged.
Okay, Paul?
Thanks. I would say, I'd characterize it as, well, first of all, let me say that I think the best way to think of the public sector is to take a very broad definition. So not just government, but everything else as well, as I think you said, Marisha. And I'd characterize the relationship between public sector broadly defined and private sector, perhaps more narrowly defined, as at the moment being very vigorous, very, very vigorous and dynamic, but at the same time not quite as coherent as I think it's going to be and going to have to be over the coming years. And I think it's also unequal. And what I mean by that, and perhaps we'll come back to it, is that in the private sector there's just masses of activity, contribution, initiative, masses of it. We could go through lists and lists of things that are coming out of the private sector. There's clearly a lot of activity at the government level. Indeed, part of that is engaging with the private sector. There's a lot going on in civic society, masses going on. But I think as far as the general public are concerned, we're still at the point in 2019 where there's frankly not a great deal of interest in all of this, or an awareness and activity. So I think that one dimension of the public aspect of this discussion, I think, is still lacking. And I think that we were talking about this over lunch, and I think that's what needs to be educated upwards, if you like. And I think it also probably needs a little bit of shock treatment to get it up to a more useful level.
Shock treatment. That's very provocative. Go ahead. Hey, Al.
Well, we see some signs of progress when it comes to, for example, information sharing or forming of best practices and circulating them within the industry. But what, at least from my personal perspective, is very apparent is that nations and governments are not equipped to actually provide an holistic civilian strategy in terms of cyberspace. And I'll give an example. As we all know, cyberspace is a distinct domain. It requires, dedicated resources, unique terminology, special attention. So as part of it, nations need to decide where to place their organizations that will devise national strategies and actually implement them on a daily basis. So if a nation, for example, place those organizations under their military, they would probably perceive cyberspace or cyber threats as a manifestation of warfare, and will act accordingly. If they will place them under the auspice of internal security organizations or law enforcement, they would probably perceive it as a demonstration of insurgency or maybe terror. And viewing or looking at cyberspace through that kind of distorted lens is very problematic. Only by actually delegating responsibilities to civilian organizations that are able to implement a more comprehensive strategy, to apply a more comprehensive strategy, that's the only way to actually communicate in the same language with those civilian organizations, with the private sector. So I think that the approach towards PPPs, private-public partnerships, are only a symptom of a wider philosophy towards cyberspace. I think that's a very important premise to put here.
Greg, you want to add?
I'm gonna mic. Okay. So I think it varies by each country. I think in the developed countries, we tend to see that they've passed laws, put in regulations in place, established cybersecurity risk management frameworks, and there's more collaboration between the private sector and the government agencies. In the United States, for example, for I'd say almost 20 years now, there's been a very close partnership between the private sector and all of the government agencies, both the civilian, the military, and the intelligence. And there's a great deal of collaboration, cooperation, what I'll even call staff augmentation, where the government can't always get the resources that it needs by its own employees, so it supplements by providing private contractors to come in and provide services in a wide variety of cybersecurity skill areas. But again, as I travel around the world, I see that it varies quite significantly. Like in Israel, for example, they've established in the last couple of years a national cybersecurity authority. And the director general of that came out of the military, but he was really designed, set up a capability to oversee the commercial sector and to oversee the government civilian agencies to help facilitate best practices from the military and intelligence complex into the commercial sector. And so I think some of the things that the Israelis are doing in that area is very leading edge. I mean, recently in Australia, we've seen new cybersecurity laws come out. In China, some are more towards data privacy, some are more about security. Obviously, the EU with their general data protection regulation is looking for greater involvement on data security and data privacy and collaboration. So I think there's a lot of positive steps, but I think it does vary significantly by country and sort of their level of maturity around the cyberspace.
Okay, I want to come back to Europe and their new legislation on privacy in a second, because I think it's very important, because it shapes the conversation that we might have about whether or not government, where they overreach in partnerships, whether or not government initiatives have a thwarting effect or whether they have an accelerating effect. But first I want to come back to you, Paul, because a moment ago you said that really what the public needs is something like shock treatment to understand the importance of this issue. What does shock treatment look like?
Yeah, I wasn't being all that brutal about it. What I mean is to say that I think we need to consider certain actions, and I'm thinking really in terms of behavioral economics, nudge theory and all that kind of stuff. And this is a debate that's been rolling along in the UK for quite some time, and I guess in many other countries. And it's to say, for example, if you're in the retail banking sector, and we all know perfectly well that skimming frauds, all these sorts of things are happening all the time, largely because of unprotected computers going online for online banking. And so what the retail banks have been gently, cautiously thinking about is how much of the loss can be attributed to the individual customer's idiocy. Which is what, of course, they quite like to do, not least because they don't want to bear the entire cost, but because they would also like to ensure that their banking system is as tight as possible. So that's what I mean by the shock treatment, just transferring a bit of the onus of responsibility to the user. And of course, the problem, though, in the banking sector, as in all countries, I guess, is that the first bank to do this is pretty worried about customer loss or customer flight. So you end up in this, who's going to go first, and that's the idiot bank. So we're still stuck in that. But I think it's worth thinking about. It's worth considering how we can take this sort of initiative forward. And that's what I mean by shock. So it's a very gentle sort of shock.
Yeah, it's a really good point. In the United States, we have this big thing called the National Vulnerabilities Database. This is really the most important thing in many ways that the US government does. It's run by about like 2 guys. And it's just a very up-to-date, basically a spreadsheet that says all of the new vulnerabilities that have been found recently that you can protect against. And the vast majority of cyber attacks that hit really any system are already disclosed to the public on that vulnerabilities database. Like this is, it's not just 0 days. It's not exotic wizards, shooting ones and zeros into infinity. It's things that people already know exist. So along the lines of shock treatment, if there was regulation in the United States or in other countries, and it's hard, of course, to draw a monolithic picture of all of them, but if there was legislation that essentially penalized not being fully up to date on vulnerabilities that have been disclosed, that sort of thing, is that something that could be helpful? Greg, is that the sort of thing that, from a company perspective, they might then ask, well, who's going to pay for us to keep up with this? And isn't that going to create a lot of burden, especially for companies that aren't Fortune 500 companies? Where do we, going forward, in terms of legislation, punishing the stupid, punishing the incompetent, and on a corporate level, where do we start with that? I'll start with you because you were nodding a little bit. I think you have a thought.
Well, I do, because I think one of the sort of bigger questions here is, where does accountability come from? And I think to start suggesting that people are stupid or naive and that those are the biggest challenges, I think, is kind of turning it upside down, because with big power, and a lot of these companies, but also states still have a lot of power, should come big responsibility. And I indeed agree that negligence or reputation saving, for that matter, if there's a known vulnerability, but if it would cost reputation for a software company or bank to say to their customers, look, we've been breached, we've been attacked through vulnerability, you now have to take step A, B, and C, that also discloses the sort of absolute vulnerability of the product, right? So I think there's often a tension between what is the public interest and also sharing information, for example, between the private sector and the government, so that the proper steps can be taken. Those incentives have to be increased. And that is by, on the one hand, preventing the worst possible outcome. So I've worked on, for example, mapping the steps taken for vulnerability disclosure and stockpiling or the dealing with vulnerabilities on the part of governments, to look what is the state of play in Europe. And there are massive differences between member states. Some member states have sophisticated protocols and very transparent mechanisms for the private sector and for their own behavior. Other states have not done anything. So to at least bring the minimum level of prevention up, to say, as governments, we're only going to do what we think is minimally necessary. Of corporations, we're going to ask that they take certain steps. And only when you have a norm, you can assess whether the norm is violated and therefore whether there should be consequences. What I see now is that in a number of areas, there's not yet such a norm. Therefore, there's a lack of accountability. And I cannot blame individuals if they see massive hacks or breaches taking place with zero consequences. No fines, no people going to prison, no attribution, no one held to account, that they don't feel empowered to do something themselves. So we have to really raise the bar of prevention, protection, and accountability. And I think that can be quite ruthless. Because if out of some kind of private or reputation consideration, there's not enough investment in cybersecurity while the tasks of providing cybersecurity or dealing with the data of hundreds of millions of people is taken on, it has to come with minimum thresholds.
And I want to get Greg's reaction to ruthless, because I bet that there is one. But first, you mentioned that there are a couple of different places in Europe. There's wide diversity among the way different countries are tackling this. Can you name one or two that's tackling it particularly well?
Yes, the Netherlands and France.
Okay, there you go. All right, so ruthless, what do you think? Are you in favor of ruthless approach to corporate hygiene and vulnerability disclosure, or what else is needed, do you think, Greg?
So I look at the United States market, for example, which is a huge marketplace. Each of the major sectors, industrial sectors, have today very specific cybersecurity risk management frameworks, and some actually already have, to your point, public laws and mandatory regulations around. And I do want to make a differentiation, because you use the term disclosure of vulnerabilities. That's at a much lower level. What most government agencies are asking for today, and regulators, is disclosure after a breach. Okay, and there's a big difference, because candidly, every organization has vulnerabilities, okay, that need to be managed because the technology is constantly evolving. There's a big difference between a vulnerability and an actual breach that has significant impact. And so, for example, in the United States, the Department of Defense, since December 31st of 1997, has required that every government contractor, especially in the Department of Defense and all of their supply chain, if they're dealing with the DoD, that they have an independent assessment against the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's called NIST 800-171 specific requirements. And there are penalties for non-compliance, but again, it's within reporting a breach within 48 hours, and there's a list of over 130 individual what's called information security controls that have to be in place, and those government contractors have to be audited against. And let me give you one other, for example. Also in the United States, our healthcare industry, which again is privatized and is enormous in terms of number of hospitals and healthcare facilities, has a public law that was passed by the Obama administration referred to as HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which requires that all organizations have well-established cybersecurity policies, plans, and procedures, that they have designated a chief information security officer, that they conduct, at least on an annual basis, vulnerability assessments. But it does not require that those vulnerability assessments be publicly disclosed, only that if they have a significant breach, that information be shared and reported to try to help, again, mitigate the potential impacts on other organizations. So I just want to clarify.
Sure.
I think there should be reporting of breaches. I don't think companies should be asked to report on all their vulnerabilities.
Okay, I almost to chime in on this, and then I think we have a counterpoint.
Sure. So I just wanted to take a broader, to provide a broader perspective. I believe that regulation is imperative. I believe that in some cases maybe fines are also imperative. But I think that in many cases, coercion is not the best possible solution for the problems in hand. And I'll give you an example. I think it starts from understanding the landscape, right? So, for example, there are some private organizations that would probably benefit from if you'll apply a voluntary approach towards them. So enable them to cooperate on a voluntary basis with a national CERT or CCERT. That's the way you can actually engage with them. That's the way that they actually get a sense of control over the process. That way you can maybe boost information sharing and other measures that could be relevant for those organizations' robustness and resilience. But in the same time, there are other organizations. There are some organizations that might benefit from, more sector-specific regulation, because that way, if you have sector-specific regulation or even sector-specific entities that work on those topics, there is common language, understanding of their day-to-day operations. So that way, the government and the private sector could communicate better. And of course, there are critical infrastructures where, because the risk of damaging those infrastructure could be so devastating, then that the government needs to take a more heavy-handed approach and actually regulate much more closely those organizations, because of the potential impact of, or the cascading effect of damaging one of those infrastructures. So I think it's all revolves around how do you define the subject matter, how do you define the relevant private sector entity that you're trying to work with.
Okay. You had a comment related to that.
Well, I did, but it was more about the earlier part about, the disclosure only applying to a known breach, because I think there's also still the question of negligence. If you are building crappy products or software, then I think there has to also be a spotlight on that. And this all boils down to the question of who pays the price, not only of an attack, but also of the costs of an attack, or the cost of negligence, or even the cost of outdated software. I mean, what we learned after WannaCry was that there was a lot of outdated software being used by those public institutions, and that they basically did not have the means to update the software to a level that is needed with today's vulnerabilities in, attack land. So the question is then, who is responsible for this?
Right. Well, I think
and companies say, well, we offered an update, but it cost X, and the hospitals, public hospitals, were not willing to pay it. Public hospitals say we have to choose between, emergency rooms or updating our basic software. It's not a priority for us. So the sort of broader scale management of how to ensure that not only today, but also going forward, Internet of Things has been mentioned, super important. If you don't put in minimum requirements and also scenario planning of what will happen once exponentially more potentially outdated or vulnerable devices are in the hands of more citizens without the proper knowledge of the vulnerabilities, where does it lead us? Because clearly already our Western societies or more developed societies are at more risk of being attacked because more people are connected.
Yeah.
So we have to, I think, connect the dots a bit and really look at how these chains of command, chains of responsibility and of accountability look.
Okay. There's a ton in that we definitely could spend some time unpacking in terms of whether or not a company that the NSA developed an exploit toward is a crappy company because the NSA hacked them. I think it's a matter of sort of subjective opinion, but that's every company. So turn to Slido here because we've got a lot of questions coming in. Is there any way to measure in dollars damage done by cyber attacks or intellectual property theft, e.g. China? Is there already a cyber insurance? There's already a couple of examples of a cyber insurance. Where is that? What are the ones that are successful and what are the ones that provide a model?
I think successful would be in the eyes of the individual company after they've been breached, and if they feel like they've been properly compensated. I would say in most cases, in my experience, when I've been engaged by private companies and they've been breached, they need help putting together a cyber liability insurance claim that the insurance companies are often hesitant to pay out for all the damages associated with it, both from a hardware, software, the actual recovery, and not only the eradication of the malware, but potentially the replacement, as well as the education and training of the workforce may need to go into place. So I think there's a lot of issues of concern around the insurance industry and around how they're evaluating the cost of cyber liability insurance, the coverage that's actually provided, And more recently, there's been some significant legal cases that are still in dispute, I'll say, or still in litigation, where companies have been attacked, and it was disclosed that those attacks were sponsored by nation states. And the insurance companies then claimed that they would not be held liable under a force majeure clause because it was essentially an act of war. And if it's an act of war, they're precluded from having to make a payout. And so we've got now legal cases where major corporations are suing their insurance companies because even though they're paying millions of dollars for their cyber liability insurance company, there's no question they've been breached. The question is now, should they be held liable because of the nature of the attack?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Just to interject very quickly, I mean, I think we're talking about Zurich Insurance and
Yeah.
Petya and the act of war, which I mean, it seems to me is an extraordinary moment that we've arrived at when an insurance company, part of the finance sector, is telling the rest of the world what war is and isn't. Interesting moment. I think I've been looking at this for many years. I'm not a tech person, but from the sort of security policy perspective, for about 18 or 19 years. In the last 10 years or so, I've been seeing more and more interest and involvement from insurance and reinsurance, interestingly and very importantly, as the kind of backstop. I'm a Brit, I shouldn't use the word backstop, should I really? But there we
Yeah,
go.
you're fine. Yeah, we figured it out.
So I think it's certainly moving faster. But in my understanding, if there's someone here from insurance, it'd be great to hear from you. My understanding is it's still very slow, very cautious, and that the currency amount of risk that's underwritten, the cyber risk that's underwritten, is minute compared to what the actual market is at the moment. So we're still in transition, I guess, and I can kind of understand that caution because the measurement of risk and harm and so on in cyberspace is still in its infancy. So as I was saying over lunch, this is somewhere where we need to be doing some more work on.
So I want to change gears real quick over here. If you're interested in this subject, there's a very good paper out in 2017 from Inicia that looks at public-private partnerships. And what's great about it is that they break it down in terms of the different sort of types of governmental bodies that create these partnerships with private institutions. And by their figures from 2017, private service operators are about 70%, law enforcement is 12%, and national intelligence agencies are about 7%. So as an American, I look at that and I immediately think, well, what are the privacy implications of public-private partnerships in the future? And how do you navigate creating better partnerships while at the same time paying attention to the public need for privacy protections from some of these companies that have this stuff? So can you give us a sense of what the future legislation in that area potentially looks like, or what it should look like from your perspective, or what you're afraid of? Go ahead. Anybody. Jump ball. Maricha.
This is indeed one of the aspects of the question, how is the public interest protected? And obviously one of the main fundamental differences between the EU and the US is that in the EU, privacy is a right. So it's a very different kind of requirement also to protect a right than to see it only in, let's say, consumer context or something like that. So the General Data Protection Regulation, one of the most known products of EU lawmaking by now, I believe, is one effort to try to create clarity vis-a-vis the private sector and governments in how data should be treated, and to empower individuals to, for example, take data to make it more portable if they want to switch services, but also to have minimum requirements, to have requirements about what to do when there's a breach. So I think we will see more of this kind of legislation, which is aimed at protecting the rights of people, but also making sure that the companies that are so powerful in this space are at least respecting minimum requirements, like antitrust and fair competition, or non-discrimination when it comes to the use of algorithms. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of issues that have still not been clearly articulated. But if you ask me what I think will happen and should happen, is that the rights will be the sort of anchor from which there will be an attempt to enforce and to assess whether the behavior of companies, even if they're at the other end of the world, complies.
Yeah.
And I also believe that that's the best way to go, not to regulate technology by technology because it's way too slow and it's way too fragmented. You should focus on the principles that need protection and then empower, in an ideal world, the regulators to assess whether that happens, and if not, what the consequences should be.
Okay. So I mean, I have some concerns there, right? Because you're also potentially talking about regulation that might harm the ability of intelligence agencies or law enforcement to carry out their duties. And while there's very clear sense of European rights on a national level and on a local level, there's also a very clear sense of what is the mandate of law enforcement. So do you see any conflict potentially there?
Well, I don't know exactly what you have in mind, but I think it is perfectly normal in a democracy to have law enforcement and intelligence services bound by restrictions,
Right.
and to have oversight and to not have unlimited powers and abilities. And I think generally we are quite behind in regulating a lot of the tech sector. I know few sectors that are so powerful and so under-regulated. And so I would suggest that we focus first on the bulk, which is making sure that there's non-discrimination, that the rule of law applies online, and then the specific needs of the intelligence service are probably a niche of that discussion and should not lead measures as such. Oftentimes, I think, even though I wish it wasn't so, intelligence services will do what they need to do, even if it means bending the law, if not breaking the law.
Okay. Well, let me turn to Ayel because you are a startup. I mean, you were running a startup and you're looking at a potential future of creating a company that must deal with regulation that will exist in the future. And you also have some experience in intelligence that I asked him about and he can't tell me about. So is it your opinion that there is an insufficient amount of regulation of the tech industry right now? Or also, what sort of regulation might occur that would be really bad for a startup, and what would be okay that's in line with these privacy questions?
Right. So, well, first of all, I believe that any regulation that tries to, first of all, strike a very delicate balance between privacy and security, and any regulation that deals with that tries to enhance security whilst not impeding or stifling innovation needs to create or evolve through a continuous discussion with the private sector. It should not be imposed unilaterally. So I think that only by incorporating corporations, the private sector's perspective can regulation could be really viable and valuable for entire countries and for the private sector. Now, I think I completely agree with the statement or with the assertion that that regulation usually lags behind that regulation lags behind security, and security usually lags behind technology. And if you look at most of the companies out there, usually their approach towards security is derived either from the regulatory landscape or through the perspective of their customers. And customers will always prefer usability over security. And in that context, I think that certain requirements, regulations, specific domains are essential. But again, as I said, you need to strike a very delicate balance. You don't want to impede innovation. You need to sometimes break things in order to promote cooperation, in order to promote innovation within the industry. So I do believe that a cautious policy, governments need to tread very lightly, especially in this space that is ever evolving and ever changing. That's my perspective.
Okay. So we have some new questions from Slido, and again, please feel free to send these in because we only have about 10 minutes left. The top one, are Apple devices, mainly iOS and Mac iOS devices, more secure and more resistant against vulnerabilities than devices working on Android and Windows? I think that we briefly had someone in the audience that was from Microsoft, and I think that they will say that Microsoft devices are just great. But if you guys have an opinion on that, I'd love to hear it. Anyone?
I'm just switching off my iPhone.
Yeah. I think it sort of depends on the size of the attack surface. The more software you put out, then the more vulnerabilities you're just going to have. I think it's just sort of like an issue of scale at this point, right? I mean,
So I'll just share a general observation. I'd say over the last 5 years, we've seen a significant improvement in the cybersecurity associated with those major operating systems and their platforms.
Mhm.
I think it's fair to say that we've seen a significant improvement around cybersecurity as it relates to cloud migration and cloud adoption.
Mhm.
I would suggest to you that, again, the weakest links are not usually within those world-class providers of software and systems, but rather the endpoints and the connections to those databases. That's where the real liabilities and vulnerabilities occur.
Mhm.
Not to say that inherently there aren't some bugs associated with all software platforms and operating systems, but again, to the earlier point, the largest attacks that have been done on a multinational basis, whether it was Petya, WannaCry, the Equifax in the United States, that really impacted just hundreds of millions of people all over the world, were those in systems like Cisco and Microsoft,
Mhm.
where there were known vulnerabilities and there were patches that were deployed that could have been utilized, but for a variety of reasons, some cost related, some simply they just didn't do it. Okay. They chose not to do it because, to your point, they often care more about capacity and operational usability and uptime than they do security. And so, the thought I'd like to leave the audience with is that there is an inherent difference between regulation, enforcement, compliance, and actual security. Okay? Because you can have regulation and people not comply. You can have people comply but still not really have adequate security. And so if the point is just to regulate without the idea that you're really creating security, then it's creating a false expectation, it's adding costs, and it's not adding value.
Yeah. Can I just,
yes,
just
very
I
quickly,
just
please.
just very quickly add, I completely agree. There's a reason why there's such emphasis in the cybersecurity industry on automation. Sometimes companies, organizations are not properly protected, not because they're reluctant to implement regulation. It's just really, really hard on a large scale. So the whole issue of orchestration, automation is big right now. It's going to get even bigger in the near future.
Okay. It's a very good question from Ms. Lindsay Gorman. I like this a lot because I was following this story as well. A recent NPR story detailed the gross underreporting of IP theft from Chinese government hacks. U.S. companies refuse to come forward for fear of jeopardizing business in China, and because being hacked isn't a good look to shareholders. How do we address this $57 billion a year impact on U.S. economy? Yeah, what is the future of, on the one hand, trying to gain greater advantage in the Chinese market and be first to market in China, and at the same time dealing with, as you pointed out, the largest perpetrator of cyber hacks in the world? Like, how do those things, what's the friction in the future, and how do you navigate it through public-private partnerships? Anybody?
Maybe public-private partnerships aside for a moment, because I think there is often a conflicting interest between the private sector, which has a bit of a gold rush when it comes to China, while also facing a lot of downsides, whether it's IP theft or forced data localization or joint ventures that are required, or communist cells sitting in companies. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen, but it's a fairly bizarre phenomenon. So there's a number of complaints, discriminatory actions taken, concerns that companies have, and they rightfully expect politicians like myself, I work on trade, to address these issues. But if, on the one hand, those companies are not changing their behavior for a moment, they're just rushing to go to China and expect politicians to solve the issues, then all the Chinese have to do is sit and wait. And that's kind of the approach that you sense when you address these issues, is that the politicians are the ones, quote unquote, complaining. They come with a list of demands, and the private sector, sometimes helped by national politicians or members of royal houses or whatnot, go on trade missions, and they come to bring contracts or to close contracts. This tension needs to be bridged. So in the US now, there's a lot of attention on China. It kind of came rapidly, as often it does in the US. In Europe, there's more focus on China as well, with an EU-China strategy. It is important to bring those two together. So there should be more, maybe not partnership, but strategizing between the private sector and politics, the public sector, in terms of how to deal with China. Which technologies do you not want to see bought or taken over? What role does foreign direct investment play, and how is it deployed strategically by a country like China, but also many other countries? So to connect the dots between trade concerns and economic concerns, security concerns and strategic concerns, but also, very importantly, I believe, and often missing in the discussion, human rights concerns. Because similarly to how, because of gold rush, companies are quiet about how they're mistreated, unfortunately, democracies are awfully quiet to address systematic, structural, and very fundamental human rights violations in a country like China because they don't want to lose their opportunities on the Chinese market.
Okay, I think, Greg, you were sort of nodding along there. Did you have a thought on that?
Well, you know, it's a very complex problem, and I thought you did a really nice job of summarizing all the issues that are integrated associated with it. I'll say from a technology perspective, it's very challenging. You know, we have major US corporations and other multinational corporations that we advise, and we're trying to help them be compliant with the new cybersecurity law that's in place in China, as well at the same time being compliant with the laws in their respective countries, while at the same time trying to avoid getting their intellectual property stolen by the major communication companies in China, which are actively doing that. And so it is a very significant issue. I will say there are technologies, which I won't go into, that are available in the commercial sector now for mobile phone security, computer security, levels of encryption that make it more difficult, but it's not, there's no panacea here. And so we have to be very intelligent about how we do business in China, who we do business with, and what technology we bring and what data we bring to China. I'll just put it that way.
Okay. So we are about at time, and some folks have a thing to run off to directly after this panel. So I think the rest of us might be here available for some chit-chat for a little while. But I want you to join me real quickly in thanking our panel for talking today. And so thank you so much. Really appreciate it.